Hello, welcome to this video, and on this video I will be going through the musicians who have sadly died in this year of 2023. It's that time of year again as we approach the end of what has been a very strange year, hasn't it? And at this time you sort of look back at what's happened, and we ponder on some of the musicians we've lost. So I'm going to go month by month. The musicians I'll be talking about are the musicians sort of at least relevant in some way to this channel and the stuff we talk about. But there are some musicians that are here just because they're very big names and they happen to have died as well. So we'll kick off with January. So I think the first known musicians to pass away in January was Fred White, who was the incredibly funky drummer with Earth, Wind and Fire. And when I was growing up, I used to listen to Earth, Wind and Fire and be astonished by the ensemble playing of that band, astonished by the funkiness and how locked it was, and how Fred White managed to traverse what often were quite difficult arrangements. Incredible drummer. He died relatively young at 67, early in January. And that was followed up by, of course, the real, mind-blowing death that no one expected, which was Jeff Beck. Jeff Beck died in early January. He was 78 years old. Of course, Jeff Beck came to prominence in the Yardbirds, changed the shape of rock guitar playing in the 60s. He then went on to record a number of solo albums, Piccolo and Truth, which were very important and influential on what would later be called heavy rock and heavy metal. And then in the 70s he turned toward jazz fusion, making some of the greatest jazz fusion albums of all time, like Blow by Blow and Wired. He then went on to have an illustrious career covering all sorts of bases, and he has really come out, I think, as being perceived as one of the greatest guitarists that's ever lived. So that's who we lost in January. It was Jeff Beck at the age of 78. Also, this one sneaked back by me at the time, was Robbie Bachman, who is the Bachman from Bachman Turner Overdrive, a band that I've never really listened to, but there may be some fans here. So he died at the age of 69. And then we had another heavyweight go, which was David Crosby. David Crosby was a singer, was a songwriter, probably most well known for Crosby, Stills and Nash. He wrote some incredible songs. One of my favourite songs is Almost Cut My Hair, which I think really sums up retrospectively what the 60s was about and how the 60s, the dream of the 60s went sour. It's an incredible tune. I also want to mention the tune Guinevere, which is one of the most beautiful tunes ever written, and was covered by Miles Davis, I think, on Big Fun, on one of the early 70s sort of post Bitches Brew albums. So David Crosby, he had quite a tumultuous life, and I think he did well considering the way he lived his life to get to 81 years old. We also lost a great soul singer and songwriter, Barrett Strong, who was also 81 years old. He's the guy who wrote I Heard It Through the Grapevine, Papa Was a Rolling Stone, and he wrote Money as well, which I believe the Beatles covered, and so he went. And then the last person to die in January was the incredible Tom Verlaine, who was 73 years old. Tom Verlaine was the guitarist in Television, and Television were one of those sort of late 70s American punk, post-punk bands that seemed to sit up between punk, new wave, and sort of almost like jazz and prog, and he was an incredibly interesting guitar player. So that's who we lost. A very important musician, and also a great songwriter. Marquee Moon is a fantastic song by Tom Verlaine. February, we lost a drummer called Butch Miles, who was 78 years old. He was an American jazz drummer in the sort of Buddy Rich mold. I actually saw Butch live in 2000. I played Nice Jazz Festival back when I was playing with Robert Plant. We played on the same stage, on the same bill as Booker T and the MGs. It was an incredible gig for me because I was just surrounded by legends. And after we did the gig, us, the band, me and Robert and Kev Gammond and all the guys in the band, we wandered over to an olive grove somewhere, and set up in there was the Count Basie Big Band, who were playing acoustic. And I sat and watched it with Robert, and it was an incredible sound. When you're so used to hearing, music through PA, to hear the power of a big band, especially a big band at that level. And on drums was Butch Miles, and he was incredible. So quite sad to hear that he died in February. Tim Quay, who was the percussionist in the Cardiacs, he passed away at 61, pretty young. They haven't had much luck, the Cardiacs haven't, in terms of losing people. So he went in that month, and also we lost a giant of music at the age of 94, Burt Bacharach, one of the greatest songwriters of the 20th century. March saw another giant of jazz pass away, and that was Wayne Shorter. He was 89 years old. Of course, he was the saxophone player with Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, and then the classic Miles Quintet in the 1960s, and then he formed Weather Report, perhaps with the Mavish Orchestra, the two most important fusion bands of that genre. I've talked about him extensively on here, an absolute genius. But also in that month, we lost another saxophone player, which was not as well known, but was also working around about the same time, which is a guy called Carlos Garnett. He died at 84. He'd played with Miles Davis, Art Blakey, and Pharoah Sanders. And I think he was a saxophone player on the later Miles albums that he did in the mid-70s. I always really liked Carlos Garnett's saxophone playing. We also lost Gary Rossington, who was the last surviving member of the original Lynyrd Skynyrd band. So they're all gone. He was 71 years old. And we also lost Robin Lumley, who was the keyboardist with Brand X, one of the great British fusion bands. I would hazard I would venture to say probably the greatest British fusion band. Robin Lumley was the cousin, I think, of Joanna Lumley, who is one of our great British actresses. Jim Gordon, who was one of the most incredible session drummers of the 70s, that was sort of the inspiration for the sort of studio drummers that came in, people like Steve Gadd and Jeff Porcaro. He was actually Jeff Porcaro's sort of idol growing up. An incredible session drummer that played with all sorts of different people. He played with Traffic, he was in Derek and the Dominoes, he wrote Layla, and I think he appears on Apostrophe with Frank Zappa, an incredible drummer. Later on, he became a schizophrenic, and in 1981, I think, he murdered his mother and was incarcerated in prison for the rest of his life. So an awful end to a really great musician. Talking of British jazz and British jazz fusion, a real great of the British jazz scene died in March, and that's the saxophonist Tony Coe. Now, Tony Coe has a special place in my heart because he was also member of one of the great fusion bands, which not many people know about, is a band called the Lonely Bears. Now, the Lonely Bears featured Tony Hymas on keyboards, that you might know from the Jeff Beck group, where we played alongside Terry Bozzio. This group also features Terry Bozzio on drums. Hugh Burns, who I think was George Michael's guitar player, on guitar, and then the great Tony Coe on saxophone. And this band was such a weird mix of musicians. They made 3 albums and they're fantastic, and Tony Coe is brilliant on them. So he was 88 years old, so pretty old. Fuzzy Haskins, who was the singer with Parliament Funkadelic, we all know that voice, right? He died at the age of 81. And Ray Shulman, the incredible multi-instrumentalist, primarily bass player with Gentle Giant, died at the age of 73, which is a sad thing. First of the Shulman brothers to go, 73 years old. And then another giant left us in March, and that's Ryoichi Sakamoto, who was one of the founder members of the Yellow Magic Orchestra, a pioneer of electronic music. And also, if you check out his early solo albums, he made some sort of jazz rock albums which are very, very interesting. He was born in 1952 and he had died in March, so I imagine, I haven't got his date of birth, so he's obviously 70, 71 years old. Something like that. So April saw the death of Carl Berger, who was a German-American jazz pianist. I think he played vibraphone as well. He was a composer and an educator. For anybody interested in this channel who's interested in a musician like John McLaughlin, he plays on the album Where Fortune Smiles alongside John McLaughlin and the great John Sermon. And that album, which often gets credited as a solo album by John McLaughlin, I never saw it as a solo album by John McLaughlin. I always saw it as a sort of combined one-off group. But McLaughlin really plays a heavy part on that album. And it's probably, in terms of the albums that John McLaughlin produced, it's probably the furthest out into free jazz he ever made. It's an incredible album with the sort of energy and, you know, sort of berserk bonkerness of Tony Williams' lifetime. It's an incredible album. He was 88 years old. Harry Belafonte, who was an American musician, singer, you know, also a civil rights activist, you know, and a pop star, but he sort of brought a sort of black consciousness to popular music right in the 40s and 50s. You know, this guy was nearly 100 years old. He was 96 when he died. He's the guy that sings the Banana Boat song. He was an actor, you know, a very important musician in terms of black music, I would say. We also lost Ahmad Jamal, who was a pianist, jazz pianist and composer. He was 93 years old, and he was a very important influence on Miles Davis. Also, we lost Ian Benson, who was 70 years old, right? He is a Scottish musician, and he's best known for being one of the core members of the Alan Parsons Project. He was a multi-instrumentalist. He could play saxophone, keyboards, but he's really known as the guitarist for the Alan Parsons Project. So that was quite an important prog passing away, and that is the people who died in April. May saw another prog musician pass away. Francis Monkman passed away also at 73. He played keyboards with Curved Air. He played with Matching Mole, and he almost became a household name with his work with Sky. And here in the UK, Sky was a band put together which was sort of a proggy, classical, and it was quite commercial. It was put together by the classical guitarist John Williams in the late 70s, and that really threw Francis Monkman into a sort of a sphere, which ended up with him doing things like writing the music to The Long Good Friday, I think is the film he wrote. An incredible musician. He passed away. Pete Brown, the English poet, right? This is the lyricist for Free. He wrote the lyrics to I Feel Free, Sunshine of Your Love, and White Room. And also, interestingly, in the 60s, he had a group with John McLaughlin, which was like a jazz improvisational group where he recited poetry over it. And he is mentioned on Extrapolation by John McLaughlin. He was 82. Really sad. Also in May we had Andy Rourke, who was the bass player with the Smiths, a really fantastic musician. He was only 4 years older than me, 59 years old, and he died of pancreatic cancer. It's a terrible thing. Played with a legendary band. The Smiths, of course, was a band I hated in the 1980s because I was a prog and jazz fusion fan, but as time's gone on, I have really come to appreciate the Smiths. And then in May we had an absolute music legend pass away. And I'm surprised, culturally, when you look at the effect that Jeff Beck had, this didn't seem to quite have the shock that I got when I found out this person had died. One of the biggest selling artists of all time, Tina Turner. She was 83 years old. Do I have to tell you who Tina Turner was? She passed away in May. We also had a great British bass player pass away, John Giblin, who, fantastic bass player, probably most well known as a session musician. He did a lot of work with Kate Bush. I know him for his bass playing on the album Product by Brand X. That's another Brand X member. Of course, Brand X has the incredible bass player Percy Jones, but John Giblin is also fantastic on that album, a really great bass player. June saw, if I just scroll down on my list, saw at the age of 83, again, a lot of 83s, Astrid Gilberto, who was the Brazilian samba and bossa nova singer, who of course sang The Girl from Ipanema. This is the legendary people, these are the legends passing away. And also, at the age of 81, we saw the passing of one of the greatest free jazz musicians in history, Peter Brooksman, one of the most brutal musicians on the planet, that sort of channeled sort of European frosty aggression into free jazz and really pushed the saxophone to the outer limits, laying the groundwork to what we would see later in bands like Napalm Death and all that sort of deathcore metal and all that type of stuff. An incredible musician, and he was the saxophone player with Last Exit, which was like a sort of free jazz supergroup put together with Bill Laswell. Also featured Ronald Shannon Jackson on guitar. And of course, that means that the only surviving member now of Last Exit is Bill Laswell. Where are we? So July, we lost in July Mo Foster, British jazz bass player, a multi-instrumentalist, played with all sorts of bands. I know him best as being the bass player with Jeff Beck on the album There and Back, where he formed an incredible rhythm section with Simon Phillips. And I do think that Mo also had a hit record here in the UK, if my memory serves me right, which was a sort of parody of tennis, Wimbledon, and specifically John McEnroe, where he did an impersonation of John McEnroe. Very funny and an interesting musician, very interesting career there. July sees the passing of the great Tony Bennett, one of the great American jazz singers. Tony Bennett brought to sort of almost like operatic sound to jazz vocals, especially in the 1950s with his first big hit record, Rags to Riches. And then his style changes and he develops his sort of smoky sound. Now, when I was a kid, as an up-and-coming, potential drummer, I had all my videotapes of all my favourite drummers. I had a video that was filmed by the BBC that I taped off the TV, and it was the Buddy Rich Orchestra with Tony Bennett, and I used to watch that over and over again. So although I was watching Buddy, it gave me a very, very strong affection for Tony Bennett. So that's who we lost. We also lost an English songwriter called Raymond Froggatt. Right, he died in July. He is the guy, he had hit records with Calla Levita, Big Ship and Rachel. He was part of the Birmingham scene. I did a couple of gigs with Raymond Froggatt. When I played with Quill, we did a couple of double headliners. And so I've had a personal connection. First person I think on this list that I sort of have met and had a personal connection with. So he died in July. And we also saw the very sad death at the age of 56 of Sinead O'Connor, Irish singer, the most famous for singing the Prince song "Nothing Compares to You." Also an incredible songwriter, really incredible Irish musician. The first of really two incredibly important Irish musicians that we lost this year. August saw the death at 80 years old of Robbie Robertson, who was one of the guitarist and singer and songwriter with the band. He wrote The Wait. He was also was a film composer. Martin Scorsese was a huge fan of the band and actually directed their film The Last Waltz. And he also composed the music to Colour of Money. I came across him in the 1980s. He had a comeback in the 1980s with a really big album, and I can't remember the title of it, but it had Terry Bozzio on drums, and at that time I bought everything by Terry Bozzio, so I got this album. So that's how I know Robbie Robertson, and that album's really great. It's because I'm not so keen on the band. I'm not into this Americana thing, but that was different. The production was really incredible. A band that I was into when I was a kid in a big way was Whitesnake. Not the John Sykes Whitesnake, not the big hair metal Los Angeles Whitesnake. We're talking about when Whitesnake were a really cutting, funky rhythm and blues band. And on guitarists, they had an incredible guitarist called Bernie Marsden. He's the guy who wrote Fall for Your Lovin', and he wrote Here I Go Again, two of Whitesnake's biggest hit records. Bernie Marsden, I met twice. I did a session with him at the BBC when I was playing with the blues guitarist Ian Parker, a wonderful guy, and I remember walking up to him and saying that I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Live in the Heart of the City. That was one of the first albums I ever got that I really got into because it was live and they were playing and I loved it. And last year I was at a guitar show and I saw Bernie and I went up and just said hello. He didn't know who I was, of course. He was on the phone, but I said, hello, Bernie, and I gave him a wave. And of course, this year he's now died. So a really important musician for me in terms of my development. So September, the great jazz bass player Richard Davis died. He was 93 years old, right? Played with absolutely everybody, but played bass on two jazz masterpieces that must be mentioned. The first is Andrew Hill's Point of Departure, which I feel is one of the greatest jazz albums of the 1960s. It doesn't get mentioned that much. And he also played on Eric Dolphy's greatest album, Out to Lunch. Another guy I've met, a lovely guy, was John Marshall, who was the drummer with Soft Machine. He died at 82. He also played with Nucleus and Centipede. I think he played with Philip Catherine. A really incredible drummer. A drummer I listened to a lot when I was learning the drums. I remember I had a video taped off the TV of him with Philip Catherine and the Land of Cocaine album by Soft Machine, which Soft Machine fans hate, but it's probably my favourite Soft Machine album because it's the one I got. I heard Alan Holdsworth on there, John Marshall's incredible drumming on there. October, another giant of jazz left us at the age of, I mean, how old was she? 87 years old. Carla Bley, real name Lavella May Borg. Carla Bley, I did a whole video on her. What can I say? Really, really incredible musician. One of the great jazz composers, one of the great band leaders. And she brings an energy to jazz, an approach which is unlike anything else. There's a sense of humour there. There is a sort of delicateness, but also a massive chunkiness in these great big band arrangements, which seem to traverse the worlds of cocktail jazz all the way to sort of New Orleans funks to free jazz. She made what is possibly the most proggy jazz rock album ever made, which is Escalator Over Hill. I don't know how many times I've mentioned this on this channel. It's an absolute monumental masterpiece of an album, which is almost like a jazz rock opera. It's surreal and strange. The lineup is incredible. It features everyone from Linda Ronstadt all the way through to Don Cherry. There's a band on there which is an incredible band, which is Paul Motion on drums, Jack Bruce on bass, Carla Bley on keyboards, and John McLaughlin on guitar. And the stuff on there is really the beginnings of jazz fusion. Carla Bley, incredibly important musician. Another musician that died in October is a musician I also met at a drum festival, and a really incredible bass player, and that was Aaron Spears, who was very, very young. How old was he? 47 years old. An incredible drummer, part of the sort of gospel chops school of drumming. He was one of the first guys to come on with this sort of virtuoso, funky style that was rooted in the sort of style of Dennis Chambers. A really incredible drummer, and a sad loss to drumming, Aaron Spears. November saw the death of another great Irish musician, Shane MacGowan. He was 65 years old. Obviously, he was the singer with the Pogues. and he wrote Fairy Tale of New York, which of course we're going to hear a million times over the next few weeks. We also saw a very obscure British rock jazz fusion guitarist die in November, Brian Godding. Now, Brian Godding was a Welsh jazz rock guitarist. He played a band called Blossom Toes. I know nothing about this band. I'm sure the British jazz rock aficionados will go, and he just mentioned Blossom Toes. But he was also a member of the fusion jazz rock weird prog band Centipede, which was Keith Tippett's band in the early 70s. That's the second person I've mentioned that's died from Centipede. So we've had 2 members of Centipede die this year. I'm pretty sure I'll be the only person on any video that has told you that fact. Because I don't know that much about Brian Godding, I've put some notes here and I'll read them out. University praises a jazz player, Brian Godding, who passed away on November the 26th at the age of 78, has always been in fact held in high esteem as half the musical unit that influenced the most classic rock twin guitar pairs apart together with Jim Kriegman and the legendary Blossom Toes. I don't know anything about this Blossom Toes, but I've never heard them. Right, December, which is where we're at now, we had, and this is the last one on the list, we had the passing of Denny Laine, who was an incredible Birmingham musician, came from around here. He played with Wings. He's the guy who was a songwriter with Paul McCartney that wrote Modern Kintyre. He was also, I believe, back in the day, in the early 60s, he was in the band Idle Race, which was the band where Bev Bevan, my mate Bev Bevan, first got his first professional gig. So that is my sort of rundown of the musicians we've lost in 2023. I'm 55 years old, so some of these people, you know, people like Shane MacGowan, you know, when I was a teenager at music college, we would go out to these sort of college discos and they played the Smiths and the Cure, and they played the Pogues, and Pogues was great to stomp up and down at. And I would watch the videos, and Shane MacGowan, who was only 10 years older than me, he seemed like a young guy. And to see these people now passing away and feeling that that whole world that I grew up with is slowly dying away. Now, Tina Turner's gone, Burt Bacharach's gone, Jeff Beck's gone. All, you know, the people we've lost is absolutely... It just... It's the passing of an era. It's that feeling I had in the 1980s when a lot of the really great Hollywood film actors like James Stewart and Cary Grant, you know, Laurence Olivier, they all started passing away, and you felt like that world was going into myth. And the great era of rock and roll now, that era is passing into myth. And will it be entirely forgotten in 100 years' time, or will, you know, my channel still be there? I'll be gone, and maybe YouTube will stick it into some sort of vault and people will be able to come back and not just hear about people like Shane MacGowan, David Crosby, but also hear about people like Aaron Spears and Brian Godding that could well get forgotten in the midst of time. Incredible musicians. Okay, that is the end of the video. If you like this video, please like it. If you want to see some more, you can subscribe. If you want to support me, there's 2 ways you can do that. You can become a Patreon. And if you don't want to become a patron, you can stick some money into my PayPal tip jar. It's down below. I hope you have all had a good year, 2023. It's been a very strange year for me. I wouldn't say it was good. I thought 2020 was pretty bad, and then 2021 was worse, and then 2022 was even worse, and I think this one was even worse. So it can't carry on like this, can it? Who knows? Anyway, thanks for watching this video. I'll see you on the next one.